Okay, so now that we have taken care of the main properties, let's start shaping our whitewater and let's start giving it a specific look. Before I do that, I will jump back to my geometry node. And remember, we had our extra sources on. I will turn them off, and instead I will turn on the emit from vorticity property. I will also go to my camera view and go back to my frame 1. And let's just take a quick look at the volume that will be generated by my whitewater source. So notice how most of the volume is being created where we have the splashes occurring and also where the water particles are colliding. So I guess that this emission amount will be enough. Let's take a look. I will go back to my DOP network and slightly increase the resolution just to have a little bit more particles. So we have whitewater particles emitting from the volume that we just saw. Notice again how the green particles are higher. These are the spray particles. The red particles are low under the water surface. These are the bubbles. And the particles that are now riding the water surface turn white. These are the foam particles. Okay, so this looks promising, but I mentioned that we would start to give a specific look to this white water. And if you take a look at the white water solver parameters, you will notice a tab called foam. And here I would say that you will find most of the parameters that will help you shape this white water. And these parameters are grouped in 3 areas: the clumping or density control, the erosion, and the repellent. So just as we did with the whitewater sourcing, I will turn all of these off and talk about them one by one. So first of all, the erosion, and it's probably the one that I use the most. We'll try to keep the particles where they are grouped together, and it will slowly try to reduce or to delete the particles that start to separate. And this will give very nice and defined tendrils. In my opinion, you should always try to use erosion unless you want the individual bubbles lingering for a while. So unfortunately, at this point, you will need to start to generate several tests. And of course, these simulations can take time, especially if you have higher resolution simulations. And this is why I have created a few flipbooks beforehand so I can show you the result of changing these values. So I won't have you here waiting and watching how this generates. I'd rather just show you those flipbooks. So first of all, this is the result of only using the erosion. Notice how we have very defined tendrils. Of course, there will always be some isolated bubbles here and there, but in general, I think this feels quite organic, and I particularly like this look a lot. For a moment, I will turn off the enable erosion, and I will turn on enable repellent. And again, press play. So you might have wondered, what are these points that are floating on the surface? And these are actually the repellents. What these particles will do is push away the white water particles that are being generated, and thus creating negative spaces that somehow simulate the foam that you can see on the beaches when the waves roll out. So once again, I would rather show you a flipbook that I already created than have you wait for the simulation to finish. So I will open now the simulation with erosion on and repellent. So notice how towards the end mostly we have some areas with very defined negative spaces. And I will pause the flipbook, and here you can clearly notice where the repellents would be, in the center of these empty spaces. So notice how we're starting to get different styles of white water just by changing a few of these parameters. Now, sometimes you may want to change the size of these areas of negative space, and you can do so by controlling the repellent sizes. For example, if you change the feature size to half of what we had, I'll use 0.25 and 0.45. You will now notice that the repellents are much closer together, and we could exaggerate these values to go even lower. And this will greatly impact on the perceived scale of your white water. Now, if you want the repellents to be more aggressive, you can increase the strength of the repellents, go much higher, and these negative spaces will be created much faster. Finally, you can also create a bit of noise, both in space and in time, so the size of these repellents can change. That way you can avoid a very geometric look, and you can also increase the frequency, which will rotate these repellents in time. Okay, so moving on, I will turn off the repellents and turn on the density control. I will again press play, and what the enable density control will do is try to push the white water particles apart to avoid the particles from clumping into each other. So let's take a look at the flipbook. And this would be the result with all three of these parameters on: erosion, repellents, and density control. And notice how the white water tends to be more solid because the particles are spreading out much more, as opposed to the thin tendrils that we had only with erosion on. So again, at this point, I would recommend that you start creating your own flipbooks, experiment with different parameter values, and always have some real-life reference and try to achieve that look by controlling these parameters.